Before we begin, tell me, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from? Share it in the comments. I'd love to know. And if you enjoy falling asleep to true stories told slowly, you can subscribe so you don't miss the next quiet journey. Now, lie back. Let your breathing settle. Let your muscles loosen. Let the story come to you like a low desert wind, slow, ancient, soft. We are going to Egypt. Not the one in the textbooks. Not the one with gold masks and gods in jackal heads. But the one where women lived and worked and struggled and vanished. The desert has always hidden things, tombs, treasures, secrets. But it also hides stories, not the grand ones carved in stone, but the small ones lived in silence. This story isn't about queens or priestesses or goddesses. It's about the rest. The women whose names never made it past the reed doors of their homes. The ones who weren't drawn on walls or mummified in gold. The ones who bled into the mud and sand and were swept away by the Nile and the years. We begin in a village. It doesn't matter which one. The Nile cuts through Egypt like a long spine, and along its ribs are countless settlements, some baked into the earth, some floating on reeds, some little more than clusters of clay and hope. The sun here is not soft. It rises early. It burns long, and it sees everything. A woman named Hetepi wakes before the sun. Her name means satisfied. It is a joke. She hasn't been satisfied a day in her life. She is 32. But in this world, 32 is old. Her teeth ache. Her knees pop when she stands. Her breasts, once full from nursing, now hang like soft clay. Her husband, Nebmat, is already outside, tending the barley, or pretending to. He rarely speaks, only grunts. They have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The girl's name is Iset, named for the goddess. It means throne. Hetepi gave her that name in a moment of foolish hope, that she might sit higher than her mother ever did. But Iset is 8 now, and already her eyes have dimmed, not with sadness, but with understanding. Even at 8, she knows what the world expects of her. To wake early, to kneel often, to carry water, to fetch wood, to bleed quietly, and to one day be given, like a sack of dates, to another man, for another life, where she will wake early and kneel and carry and fetch and bleed again. Fiwo. Hut they live in is made of mud bricks, stamped by Hetepi's own hands. It leans slightly to the left, but it keeps the sun out mostly. The floor is sand, the walls are cracked, but there's a small shelf, her only luxury, where she keeps bits of painted pottery and a shard of mirror. She looks at her face once a week. No more. It's not that. She hates it. It's just unfamiliar. Her face has become something separate, a tool, a disguise, a silence. In ancient Egypt, women were technically equal to men in law. That's what the scribes will tell you. They could own land, testify in court, even divorce. But laws mean little when written in a language only priests can read. In practice, a woman's life was governed by birth. If she was born to a craftsman, she might help with tools. If she was born to a farmer, she might carry wheat and scatter it in the field. If she was born to a noble, she might be cloistered behind linen walls and trained in grace and obedience and bearing sons with symmetrical eyes. And if she was born to nothing, she became nothing. Hetepi was born to a papyrus cutter. Her father made scrolls for scribes in the city. She remembers the smell of damp reeds, the feel of fibers under her fingernails, but not much else. He died when she was 6. Her mother remarried. Quickly, to a man with a scarred lip who beat her softly, not in anger but in habit. Hetepi learned then how to disappear in plain sight, how to breathe without sound, how to sleep with one eye open. When she was 12, she began to bleed. A mother handed her a folded scrap of linen and said, "You are a woman now." No more was said. No celebration, no ceremony, just a nod and a loaf of stale bread. At 13, she was given to Nebmat. He was 15 years older, had a good patch of barley, a donkey, and 2 goats. Her mother called it a fortune. The wedding was brief, some beer, some incense, a blessing from a passing priest who didn't know either of their names. That night she lay on the packed earth floor. Nebmat lay beside her. He didn't ask. She didn't refuse. It was not rape. Not in the way stories describe it. But it was not love, nor anything close. It was simply expected. Over the years, she learned to make peace with her silence. She bore 3 children, nursed them with cracked nipples and sore arms, learned to cook lentils 100 ways, learned which herbs helped cramps, which leaves cooled fever, which shadows to stand in, which words to avoid. Let that knowledge float now. Let it drift like sand across stone. It's not yours to carry, just something you've passed by. In the village, the old women gather near the kiln. They sit on stones, chew dried figs, and speak in riddles. They talk about dreams, about gods who walk backward, about animals with human eyes. Hetepi doesn't join them often, but she listens. And once, one of them said something she never forgot. The gods give men temples, but they put women in stories, and then they burn the stories. She didn't understand it then, but she does now, because everything she is and everything she's done is a story that will never be carved into stone. The records of Egypt are full of names: kings, warriors, priests, even a few queens. But not Hetepi, not her daughter, not the women who bent over grinding stones for hours every day, not the women who delivered babies in the dark with only herbs and breath and prayer, not the women who died in childbirth or from fever or from grief. Their bones are in the sand, but their names are gone, erased not by fire, but by time and by design. Let that erasure settle gently. It is not sharp. It is soft, like dust on papyrus. In the temple of Hathor, the goddess of love and joy, there are carvings of women dancing, smiling, offering flowers. But those are ideals, symbols, not lives. Hetepi has never danced. She smiles only for her children, and the only flowers she has touched were the dried ones she used in tea when her youngest had a cough. Even the goddesses are distant. Isis, Nephthys, Sekhmet. They are powerful, but also untouchable. They do not bleed. They do not cook. They do not nurse. They do not kneel. They do not become invisible. But Hetepi does. Every day, every hour. Not because she is weak, but because the world decided not to see her, and still she endures. Let that endurance echo now. It is not heroic, not loud, just steady, like the pulse of the Nile, like breath, like history that isn't written, only lived. And so we leave Hetepi, for now, not because her story is done, but because it has. No ending, only pauses, only drifting. We'll return soon, Sarmad, to the streets, the temples, the kitchens, the tombs where women waited and worked and were forgotten. We return now slowly, like the Nile returning to its banks. The water recedes, the silt settles, and beneath it, stories rise, not of glory, not of gold, but of hands worn raw, of eyes turned inward, of lives that passed unnoticed, but never unfelt. There is a house in Wasit, Thebes as some later call it, not large, not grand, but standing, square, sun-baked and shaded by a tree so old that its roots no longer grow. It simply exists. Like the woman inside. Her name is Tineferu. Her hair is black, oiled, wound into coils wrapped in linen strips. Her lips are cracked. Her fingers, thick at the knuckles from years of labor, curl around a pot that's almost too hot to hold. She stirs and stirs and stirs. For hours. A stew made not of choice, but of what's left. Onion root, beet stalks, thin broth from bones boiled 4 times, a single scoop of lentils, 2 cloves of garlic crushed with the heel of a stone. The air smells of dust and ash and something older, something under the surface. This is what she does, day after day, hour after hour. There are no clocks, but her body knows the time, knows when the sun tilts, when the doves quiet, when the neighbor's baby cries for the 2nd time. She moves without question, without pause, without being seen. Let her breath reach you now, soft, distant. It is not yours, only something you've passed by in the dust of memory. Tinaferu was born to a family of scribes, which means she was never taught to read. That privilege was for her brothers. They memorized spells from the Book of the Dead, learned the shapes of gods, traced lotus petals onto walls. She learned the weight of water, the sting of smoke, the names of every herb that soothed a man's stomach after too much wine. Her father died during flood season, swept into the river while trying to rescue a neighbor's boat. His body was never found. Her mother wore white linen for 70 days, then returned to the market to sell honey cakes. Mourning has its limits, especially for the poor. Tinaferu's childhood was not cruel, but it was quiet. She was not beaten. She was not starved, but she was not heard either. In ancient Egypt, a woman could be strong, but only in private. She could be wise, but only in silence. She could be skilled, but only in service of others. So she watched, and waited, and folded herself into the shape of what was expected. There were rules, unwritten ones. Don't speak unless asked. Don't laugh too loud. Don't bleed where others can see. Don't look a man in the eye unless you intend to belong to him, and even then, only once. She was married at 16 to a potter named Amenemhat. He had a limp and a lazy eye, but steady hands and a kind enough voice. He brought her figs wrapped in cloth. He called her Nfrt, beautiful. But he also expected his shirts to be washed before the sun rose, his sandals to be mended without asking. His mother to be honored, even when she spat behind Tinaferu's back. Theirs was not an unusual marriage, which is to say, it was full of small demands, small silences, small disappointments that were never named, only endured, and endurance. That was the secret art of women in Egypt. Not grace, not beauty, not seduction, but the ability to keep going, to rise every day with the same breath, the same tasks, the same aches, and to do it again the next day, and the next, and the next. Let that repetition echo now, softly, like water in a cracked bowl. Tinaferu had 5 pregnancies. 3 children survived, 2 sons, 1 daughter. The first birth tore her so deeply that she bled for days. There were no doctors, only an aunt who boiled wine and poured it over linen, then pressed it to her thighs and whispered prayers to Hathor. The second child came fast, too fast, slipped into the world with a cord wrapped tight. He lived only an hour. She buried him with her own hands, not in a tomb, just a patch of earth near the house, under the shadow of the tree. No Shabti figures. No amulets, just a shard of pottery with a mark that only she knew. The world moved on. The stew still had to be stirred. The laundry still had to be soaked. The neighbors still came by for vinegar and gossip, because grief, for women like Tinaferu, was not a spectacle. It was a private ritual, a daily folding of memory into silence. Even the gods had little space for it. Osiris ruled the dead. But he listened mostly to priests, not to mothers. Let that forgetting soften now. Let it pass. It is not yours to hold, only a breath from someone else's sleep. Her third child was her daughter, Satsobek, daughter of Sobek, the crocodile god, a name of protection, of fierce survival, but also of fear. Taineferu gave her the name not because she was brave, but because she was afraid. Afraid her daughter would vanish like the second sun. Afraid she'd grow and be taken like she had been. Afraid she'd live and suffer and still not be seen. But Satsobek was strong. At 10, she carried clay pots full of river water without spilling. At 12, she ground grain into flour with arms like ropes. At 13, she asked why she couldn't go with the men to fish. Taineferu didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because there was no answer that wouldn't break them both. Some doors were never meant to open. Some truths were heavier than the pots they carried. One day a priest came to the house, looking for offerings, not money, spices, oils, herbs. He had been told the women in the home were skilled. He saw Satsobek and smiled, too long, too gently. Taineferu stepped between them, gave him 2 jars of balm and a promise of honey in a week. He left, but not before whispering, she would do well in the temple. Taineferu did not sleep that night. She sat by the doorway with a reed knife and stared into the dark. The temple of Hathor was known for its dancers, its sacred rites, its perfumed halls and flower-strewn floors. But behind the beauty was a cage, a golden one, yes, but a cage all the same. Girls chosen for their voices, their limbs, their smiles, trained to move like water, to be seen, but never touch, to sing for gods who did not bleed. Satsobek would not go. Not while Taineferu breathed. So they stopped going to market, stopped drawing water from the common well, became smaller, quieter, invisible. It was safer that way, for a while. Let that fear pass now. It is not yours. Only a shadow cast on a distant wall. Years later, Taineferu's hands are stiff, her eyesight dim. She sits now more than she stands. Satsobek is grown, married, to a mason with a crooked back and a quiet heart. They have 1 child, a girl, who plays with lotus pods and talks to insects, who asks too many questions, and Taineferu smiles, because that too is survival. Questions, curiosity, the refusal to be folded flat. And though the years press down, and the nights grow cold, and the gods remain distant, she remembers every task, every pain, every face, even the ones no one else does. And that remembering, it is power, it is resistance, it is proof. She lived, she mattered, and in the hush of history, her breath still stirs the dust. More soon, Samad. The Nile carries many more lives. Let the story return like a slow breath. We follow not kings or gods tonight, but footsteps softened by time, bare souls pressed into dust, hands that carried too much, voices remembered only in fragments. This is the story of women who endured, not with fire but with silence. The city of Memphis once stood proud along the Nile, its walls tall, its gates gilded with copper that shimmered like a second sun. But we don't go there for the light. We go for what hid beneath it, in the narrow alleys between temple walls, behind the shuttered windows of common houses, and within the breathless hush of kitchens where women stirred pots and whispered to each other under their breath. One of them was Nebeta. Her name meant Lady of the House of Life, though no one ever called her that. They called her Bata, softened by routine. Shortened by time. She was born in a back room of a perfumer's shop, surrounded by jars of myrrh and resin and blue lotus petals drying in the sun. Her mother, Mahu was a sharp-eyed woman with ash in her hair and cracked hands that always smelled of cedarwood. Mahu taught Nabeta two things: how to press oil from the petals without bruising them, how to keep her head bowed in the presence of men, even when she had something better to say. That was life in Memphis for most women, the constant balancing of scent and silence. Perfume was sacred in Egypt, not just vanity, but ritual. Priests bathed in it, gods were anointed with it, even the dead were wrapped in it, soaked until their shrouds could no longer breathe. So women like Mahu and Nabeta were useful, but usefulness wasn't power. It was permission. Permission to work, to be left alone, to not be taken. Nabeta clung to that usefulness the way others clung to prayers. She was quick with her hands, knew exactly how long to soak sandalwood, knew which clay jars would hold the scent longest. And when a scribe came asking for oils for the temple of Ptah, she bowed deeply, but did not smile, because smiling meant interest, and interest meant risk. Let that calculation rest now. You don't need to carry it. Just let it drift by, like scent on wind. By 18, Nabeta was known as the quiet one. She had no husband, no interest. People whispered that maybe her blood was weak, that she couldn't bear children, that she didn't want to. But no one said it loud, because when the wives of high-ranking officials came quietly, veiled and trembling, asking for herbs to slow their bleeding, they came to Nabeta. And when girls too young to know what was happening to their bodies wept in back rooms, it was Nabeta who wiped their faces and handed them hot cloths. She knew how to make fever break with blue flax and poppy seed. She knew how to coax a womb into silence. She knew how to listen without judgment. That was her power, not in titles, not in temples, but in knowing things no one else dared say. It didn't make her respected, but it made her necessary. And in a city ruled by men who worshipped silence in women, necessity was a strange kind of freedom. She moved carefully, spoke rarely, kept her gaze low, but in the back of her shop, on a shelf hidden behind jars of cassia and thyme, she kept a small strip of papyrus. On it, in ink made from crushed berries, she had written just one sentence: "I saw the sun rise, and I did not look away." No one knew she could write. Her mother had taught her in secret, tracing glyphs into flour spilled on the floor, brushing them away when footsteps came near. It wasn't for praise. It was for proof. Proof that her mind belonged to her. Let that proof settle in the dust now. It does not need to be read, only felt, but usefulness is a fragile shield. And one night, it cracked. A priest named Heb came calling. He said he needed new oils for a royal burial. He said the old recipes were failing. He said Nabeta's skill was unmatched. But his eyes said something else. They said, "You are alone." They said, "You will not be believed." They said, "I take what I want." Nabeta prepared the oils carefully, precisely, added just a bit more camphor than needed, the kind that clears the head and numbs the tongue if inhaled too deeply. When he came back for them, she smiled just once and offered him a test sample for purity. He sniffed and staggered and laughed and said she was clever. But he never came back. Word traveled. Quietly, through hand signs and glances, through women who pretended not to speak. And soon, Nabeta's shop became known for more than perfume. It became known for safety, but safety had a cost. And every night Nabeta sat by her window, grinding charcoal into ink, writing lines no one would see. They said my silence was virtue. I say it was armor. They told me not to speak. So I listened until I could no longer bear the noise. They offered me a temple. I chose a door I could close. She was never honored, never painted, never praised. But in time the temple scribes began to write down her recipes, not with her name, but with phrases like, "From the wise woman in the lower district." She didn't care. She didn't need the credit, she only needed the work. Because work was what kept her from vanishing. In Egypt, the most common punishment for a woman who refused her place wasn't death. It was disappearance. Name scratched out, a face chiseled away. Memory left to rot in the sun. But Nebetta's scent remained, on walls in cloth, in the breath of mourners standing over tombs, and that was her revenge. Let that revenge linger softly. It is not cruel, only persistent, like smoke, like memory, like a woman walking alone with her head held steady. And so we drift from Memphis, through alleys of myrrh and silence, into the deeper desert. There are more women waiting, more stories buried in jars, and we will find them, Samad, one breath at a time. Not every story is carved in limestone. Some are whispered through reeds, scribbled in soot on kitchen walls, passed from hand to hand like water in clay jars. Tonight we follow one of those stories, the kind that hides in plain sight, wearing the dust of 1,000 silent years. The desert does not rush. It takes and takes. And then sometimes it gives something back. A fragment, a bone, a name scratched into a bead, in a forgotten outpost near the edge of the Red Land, the burning sand. Beyond the reach of the Nile, there was once a small settlement called Kentmin. No palace, no monuments, just rows of mud-brick homes and a well that coughed dust half the year. The people there were miners and smugglers and basket weavers and women who had been sent away. One of them was named Heket, not for the goddess of frogs and fertility, but for the sound her mother made when she was born. A dry breath, more cough than cry, as if even her arrival had to be silenced. Heket was not born in Kentmin. She was sent there, at 15, pregnant, alone. The man was a soldier, not cruel, but careless. She remembered his fingers, always calloused, always shaking, just slightly. He gave her dates and honey. He said her eyes looked like dusk on the Nile. He never asked if she wanted him. She didn't know how to say no, not because she agreed, but because the word was never given to her. When her belly swelled, her mother wept, not with sadness, with fear. Because in the middle classes of Thebes, a girl's purity was more valuable than her breath. And so she was sent, not to a tomb, but to a border town where no one asked questions and no one spoke her name. She arrived with one bundle, 2 linen cloths, a dried fig, and a copper pendant carved with the eye of Horus for protection. It didn't work, but she kept it anyway. In Kentmin, she was given work at a dye pit, mixing indigo boiling saffron, washing wool in water so thick with pigment it stained her fingernails purple for a year. The men laughed when they saw her hands, called her flower fingers, mocked her belly. But the women said nothing, only nodded, and once an older one, Sherit with teeth like stone, placed a smooth pebble in Heket's palm and said, "Bite on this when the time comes." The time came during a sandstorm. The wind howled like a chorus of the dead. The hut rattled, the fire went out, and Heket screamed into cloth until her voice broke. The baby was still, too still, a boy. She named him Neku, meaning one who crosses, and she buried him beneath a tamarisk tree with the pendant around his neck. She did not cry. There was no time. The dye pit waited, the laundry piled. The foreman tapped his stick and said, "You've rested enough. Let that cruelty fade now, it is not yours, only a shadow left behind in someone else's dusk." Heket stayed. There was nowhere else. She worked. She bled. She learned which roots eased pain, which soothed burns, which made a man forget a woman's name. She learned how to stitch open wounds with hair, how to mend sandals, how to speak without being heard. And slowly, the women of Kentmin began to come to her, not with words, just looks, nods. Pieces of cloth tied in certain knots, signals passed between buckets and baskets. They came with bruises, with bellies swollen again, with fevered children, with questions. They didn't know how to ask, and Heket never asked who sent them. She only gave what she had, a balm, a root, a tea that brought blood when it was needed, sometimes a place to sleep, sometimes silence. That was what women learned to trade in ancient Egypt, not gold or grain, but stillness, a space where no one listened because listening meant danger. So they filled the silence with breath and work and glances that meant everything. Let that language rest now. You don't need to speak it, only feel it. Heket became known, not by name, by presence, by her steady hands, her cracked lips, her quiet fire. And when soldiers passed through, they looked away from her, as if her gaze might see too much, as if she carried knowledge that didn't belong in a woman's mouth. And perhaps she did. She kept a small pouch under her sleeping mat. In it, scraps of linen with marks drawn in dye. Not hieroglyphs, not words, just shapes, loops, lines, memories she didn't want to keep in her body, a map of pain, a record, a defiance. No one ever saw them. No one needed to. They were hers. In a world that left women with nothing, they were hers. One night Sherit fell ill. Her breathing rattled. Her hands clutched at air. The other women gathered, murmuring prayers to Sekhmet, the lion goddess of healing. But Heket did not pray. She sat beside her, held her hand, sang a lullaby. No one had sung to her, and when the breath stopped, she closed the woman's eyes. She washed the body, wrapped it in linen soaked with oils, and dug the grave herself. It was not deep. The ground was too dry, but she placed 3 stones at the head and whispered, "You are seen." The women began to do the same. When one of them died, and then many did, Heket tended the body, wrote a mark, lit a coal, and said the words, "You are seen." It became a rite, not official, not sacred, but real, and for women who had never been named. In life it mattered. Years passed, her hair grayed, her hands stiffened, and still she worked. One day, a young girl arrived, barely 12, skin blistered from walking, eyes hollow, pregnant. No one knew from where she came. No one asked. Heket took her in, fed her lentils, washed her wounds, sang the lullaby, and when the time came, held her hand. The child survived, a girl. The young mother died. Heket named the child Merineferu, beloved beauty. She raised her, taught her the dye pits, taught her the marks, taught her the silence, taught her how to look and not look, to carry and let go, to kneel and to stand. And when Heket's breath began to fade, she handed her the pouch and whispered, "Don't forget us." Merineferu buried her beneath the same tamarisk tree, with the same copper pendant and the same 3 stones, and she lit the coal, and she said the words, "You are seen." Let that seeing echo now, not loud, just steady, like a heartbeat, like breath, in the dark. Hecate's name does not appear on any scroll. There is no statue, no hymn, no offering table, but her memory survives. In the women who came after, in the way they brewed tea, in the way they tied their headcloths, in the way they stood just slightly closer when another woman wept, and in the marks, still buried, still waiting, beneath the sleeping mats of border towns. We will continue soon, Sarmad. The sands still hold many more stories. The story returns like water winding through stone. You don't need to follow every word, just rest and drift. Let the voices of the forgotten come softly, one layer at a time. The kind of voices that don't call out, they whisper. That don't scream, they remember. In the middle of Egypt's long shadow, in the crook where the Nile bent just enough to touch the feet of the cliffs, there was a place where limestone was carved and carried. Deir el-Medina, a village built for tomb workers, craftsmen, stonecutters, painters, men who dreamed of eternity while carving the bones of pharaohs into rock. It was a place of skill, of divine labor, but also of secrets. Hidden behind the chisels and pigments were the women, the wives of tomb workers, the daughters of scribes, the mothers of boys who would never live long enough to apprentice. And among them was a woman named Ka-Iset. She lived in a house that sloped at the back, half carved into rock, half bricked by hand. There was one window, one stool, and one thin cotton veil hung over the doorway. She kept her home cleaner than most. A bowl of natron sat near the entrance, not for worship, but for laundry. Every Friday she scrubbed every surface with bitter herbs and salt, because that was the day the inspectors came to town. Men from the temple. Men who wore perfume. Men who pretended not to stare too long, but stared all the same. Ka-Iset had been a scribe's daughter. Her father, Neferhotep, had copied funerary spells onto the insides of coffins, small, careful glyphs. Always the same prayers. May your heart be light. May you pass through the gates. May your soul be known. He told Ka-Iset once that writing was a kind of magic, that what was written could never die. She believed him, even when her mother died in childbirth, even when her father sold her to a tomb mason for 12 baskets of grain and a piglet, even when that mason, who smelled of ash and beer, told her not to speak unless spoken to. She believed that if she remembered the words, she would not vanish. So she remembered. She could not read, but she knew the glyphs by shape. The owl, the loaf, the horned viper, the seated woman. She traced them in ash on her thighs at night, whispering them like prayers. The seated woman was her favorite, not because it meant anything specific, just that it existed, that someone had once drawn a woman sitting upright, looking forward. It felt like resistance. Let that resistance rest now, like ink in the bottom of a pot. Ka-Iset bore 3 children. 2 lived. One, the girl, died in her second winter. A fever that twisted her limbs until she couldn't cry. Ka-Iset buried her beside a fig tree. There was no priest, no ceremony, just a broken bracelet and a handful of barley scattered into the wind. She did not mourn in public. Grief was not a luxury women could afford in Deir el-Medina. There were pots to mend, bread to bake, children to clothe, and neighbors who watched everything. So she tucked her grief into the corners of her house, into the cracks between bricks, into the folds of her skirts, into the slow way she stirred lentils at dusk. That was how women survived in a village of stone and silence, by folding and folding, until even pain took up less space. But pain has a way of finding cracks. One day her husband came home with blood on his tunic. Not his, another man's. An accident in the tomb chamber. A slab had shifted. There was shouting. Then silence. Kaiset washed the tunic in silence. Hung it out before dawn. Said nothing. The next day he didn't come back. The foreman said he'd been taken for questioning. The overseer said it was nothing serious. The neighbors said it was about the missing copper. Kaiset said nothing. She waited, and after 7 days she knew. He was not coming back. Disappearance was common for men who asked too many questions, for men who saw too much, for men who spoke of things beyond their rank. And when they disappeared, their families lost everything. No rations, no cloth allowance, no protection. Just a name scratched off the work list and a door left to rot. So Kaiset did what many women did. She erased him, scrubbed his sandals, burned his belt, taught her sons to say he was dead, from illness. And then she learned to sell her hands, not her body, her labor, to grind pigment, to carry water, to stitch linen with the smallest, fastest loops in the village. She never begged, never asked, just showed up and worked. And slowly the village allowed it. One bowl of barley, one lamp wick, one gesture at a time. There was an old woman named Henut who helped. Henut was nearly blind, but she knew every path by foot. She brought Kaiset dried pomegranate peel once and said, "Boil this when the bleeding won't stop." Then added, "Don't ask who told me, just trust it works." They never called it medicine, never used words like midwife or healer, because titles drew attention. And attention was dangerous. Let that danger drift now, let it pass. It's not yours, only a whisper left behind. When Kaiset's eldest son turned 12, he was sent to the work crew. He returned home with raw fingers and a quiet rage. Said the overseer struck him for dropping a chisel. Said the other boys laughed. Kaiset listened, then brought out a cloth, unrolled a bone needle and stitched a small pouch. Inside it, she placed a scrap of natron, a tiny feather, and a dried beetle shell. Nothing magical, just weight, just something to hold. "Keep it on you," she said. "When you are afraid, touch it." He never asked what it meant, but he wore it every day and never cried again. He grew, carved, painted, married, left, like most sons. And Kaiset was alone, but not lonely. She found company in routine, in the rhythm of stone and shadow. And once a week she climbed the hill above the village, not far, just enough to see the tomb walls glint in the sun, to see the shapes her father once carved, to see the names of men who had never looked her way, etched forever into stone. She'd whisper the words anyway. "May your heart be light. May you pass through the gates. May your soul be known." Then she'd walk home, hands stained with dye, feet cracked from heat, back bowed, but gaze steady, because in the end, and even in the beginning, it sucked to be a woman in ancient Egypt. But it also meant being a keeper of the quiet things, the stitch that held the linen, the recipe that broke a fever, the prayer that no one taught, but everyone remembered. These are the women we carry forward, Sarmad, not as queens, but as witnesses. We'll go on soon. There are still more lives buried in the hush. We return again, not with fanfare or footsteps, but with dust on our breath. This is the kind of history that doesn't rise in marble or flash in gold. It lingers, quiet and heavy, in the way old cloth sags, in the hush before the call. To labor, in the memory of women who endured not because they were chosen, but because they had no choice. There are places in Egypt where the heat does not scream. It waits, pressed between walls of mud and reed, soaking into doorframes, curling beneath thresholds like a silent guest who never leaves. In one such place, a riverside hamlet known only by its granary marker, Depot of the Fifth Gnome, lived a woman named Tabubu. She had no titles, no lineage. She was not daughter to any priest or artisan. She was born like so many others in a room too small for comfort and too dark for memory. Her mother was a weaver. Her father was a name she never knew. The women in her village didn't speak of fathers unless they brought bread or beatings. Tabubu was a weaver too, by 13. By 16 she was married to a man who cleaned the granary bins. Not a harsh man, but not a gentle one either. He said little, expected much, and treated Tabubu like a column in a storehouse, something to lean on, never to see. There. Home was a single room, shared with 2 hens and a mother-in-law who smelled of camphor and vinegar. Privacy did not exist, only silence and endurance. Each morning, Tabubu rose before the first bird call. She'd light the coals, kneel to grind grain, her back aching before the sun had even stretched across the walls. Then she would turn to her loom. It was old, missing a peg, and warped along one edge, but it worked. The cloth she wove wasn't temple fine. It would never drape a noble's shoulder, but it held together. And that, in Tabubu's world, was enough. Holding together even when nothing else did. Let that thread settle now, Sarmad. You don't need to pull it. Just feel it loop gently across your thoughts. Tabubu's days blurred, one warp into another. One line of thread into the next. But there was one moment each day that belonged to her. When the sun hit the window just right, a slant of gold across the floor, she'd press her fingers to the beam and whisper her own name. Tabubu. Not loudly, not to be heard, but to remind herself she was real, that she existed outside of labor, that she had shape beyond the chores, that she was not just a task. This was her rebellion. Tiny, unseen, but stubborn. There was danger in wanting more. Women who asked for time or tenderness often got less of both, so she wanted nothing. At least, that's what she told herself, until she met Hemyunu. He was a scribe's apprentice, sent from the city to oversee grain counts. He had soft hands and a habit of humming when he worked. He wasn't kind, not exactly, but he noticed things. He asked her name, not because he needed it for a tally, but because he wanted to know it. He asked what she was weaving. She told him. He said it was beautiful. She didn't believe him, but it stayed with her. The way he looked, not at her work, but at her hands, like they mattered. That night, she couldn't sleep. She traced circles on her palm, wondering what it would feel like to be seen, really seen, but wanting, even silently, could cost a woman everything, and it nearly did. Hemyunu began to linger, offered her chalk for her loom. Comb made from smooth bone, nothing grand, just small things that said you are not invisible. And one day, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Not out of love, not out of hope, just to feel something, anything. But someone saw, a neighbor's daughter, eyes like flint, and within a day whispers curled through the village like smoke. Tabubu was summoned, not to court, not to a priest, but to her husband's mother, a judge in her own right, who struck Tabubu across the face and said, "You belong here, not to dreams, not to men who write." Hemyunu left the next morning, sent back to the city. The chalk was taken, the comb burned, and Tabubu returned to her loom, fingers swollen, lips cracked, but she still pressed her hand to the beam, still whispered her name, because even after punishment, even after shame, her name was hers, the one thing she could keep. Let that name echo now, not loudly, just enough to remember. Tabubu. She didn't die young, nor old. She died in summer, when the air was thick with grain dust, and the birds forgot how to sing. Her cloth was sold, her loom passed down, her name forgotten, except by one. A young girl who had watched her work, watched her whisper, and on the morning of Tabubu's burial, that girl, now 15, now married, pressed her hand to the same beam and whispered, "Tabubu." She said it 3 times, then added her own. And so the thread continued from woman to woman, not through blood but through breath, not through lineage but through labor, and in a world that carved kings into eternity and left women in the dirt. It mattered because memory, when shared, becomes survival. Let that survival settle like linen folds, soft, layered, worn, but still here. The past doesn't shout, it breathes, slow, warm and heavy with dust. In the rooms where incense once burned, in the cellars where clay pots lined the walls, and in the hands that moved without question, the story of women in ancient Egypt waits not to be discovered, but to be remembered. There is a place where the Nile runs so slowly it forgets its own name, where the banks are high, and the mud is thick, and the houses sit low, their roofs made of palm thatch, their windows no more than holes plugged with cloth. It's not a city, not even a town, just a stretch of clustered dwellings in the floodplain north of Abydos. The kind of place mapmakers skipped. In one such house lived Baketamun, a woman of 40 winters, born in the same room she would one day die in. Her name meant servant of Amun, though she served no temple. Her family gave her that name in hope, not of piety, but of favor. To be named after a god meant nothing if the god didn't answer. And for most of Baketamun's life, the gods were silent. She was the 3rd daughter of a mud brick maker, a man who chewed henbane leaves for the pain in his knees and shouted when the mix dried too fast in the sun. Her mother Tia was stern-eyed and straight-backed, with a voice like dried papyrus and a palm that never missed. Tia had birthed 9 children. 5 died before their 5th year. Of the 4 who survived, only Baketamun stayed near. The others, 2 brothers, 1 sister, had married into other villages, the way reeds drift in flood season and are never seen again. Baketamun was not married. She had been, once, a man named Pashedu who worked in the marshes, bundling papyrus stalks. He was kind at first, gave her dates, braided her hair with bits. They of shell, told her laugh was like water on stone, but water runs dry, and words can turn. Pashedu had a temper, not the kind that burned hot and vanished, but the kind that simmered. He didn't strike her, not with hands, he didn't need to. He struck with silence, with withheld food, with mocking glances that made her question her own mind. He told her she was lucky he'd married her, told her no one else would, that her hips were too wide, her voice too deep, her hands too rough. She believed him until she didn't. It took 3 years, and one long night during the flood season, when the waters rose higher than they had in decades, and Pashedu was trapped across the river, that she packed what she could into a reed basket and walked barefoot back to her mother's home. She expected to be turned away, but Tia only looked at her swollen feet, her empty eyes, and said, "Tend the fire. It's low." That was all. No judgment, no embrace, just the work. And in that, a kind of love. Let that kind of love settle now. The kind that does not speak, but waits. that does not reach, but holds. Bakataman stayed. The villagers talked, not cruelly, just constantly. That she'd failed as a wife, that she was bitter, that she was cursed, but they still came to her. Because Bakataman knew how to make things last. She could mix mud so it didn't crack. She could stitch sandals so they wore evenly. She could line storage pots with pitch so they kept cool even in high summer. And, more than anything, she knew herbs, not from books, not from priests, but from her mother, and her mother's mother, from blistered hands and sleepless nights and failures that left stains. She knew how to pack fig bark against a fevered tooth, how to boil dried bitter melon for indigestion, how to press wild thyme into wounds to keep them from festering. She had no titles. But the mothers brought her their children, the wives brought her their bruises. The girls brought her their silence, and she never turned them away, not once. Let that silence echo gently now. Sarmad not to be broken, just to be shared. One girl, no more than 13, came in late autumn, eyes wide, hands trembling. She had been betrothed to a man twice her age, had seen him once. He had no teeth. The girl had tried to run, but had been caught. Bakatamun said nothing, made her a tonic to calm her nerves, let her sleep on the mat beside the hearth. And when the girl left, she handed her a folded cloth with herbs sewn into the lining, the kind that, when steeped, delayed a cycle for a month or more. Not a solution, but a start. And sometimes that's all a woman can give another. A start. A pause. A breath. Time to think, to plan, to endure. Bakatamun lived quietly, worked daily, ate simply, and wrote nothing down. Her knowledge was not the kind that could be scribed onto scrolls. It was passed in glances, in shared bowls, in the way a woman placed her hand on another's back just long enough to say, "You are not alone." She aged. Wrinkles mapped her face like dry riverbeds. Her hair turned silver. But she didn't wrap it like the others. She let it hang, loose, unbothered. There was strength in that too, to not apologize for being seen, to take up space, softly. In her last year, her legs began to fail. She leaned more, moved less, but still kept. The fire lit, still brewed her teas, still listened. That winter she caught a chill. It settled in her chest. Wouldn't leave. The cough came in waves, her breath like broken linen, thin, uneven, fragile. She lay on her mat. Blanket pulled to her. Chinned, and one by one, the women came, not with gifts, but with hands, to clean, to grind herbs, to sweep the floor, to sit beside her without speaking. She passed at dawn, eyes open, mouth soft. No priest came, no lamentation wails. But someone placed dried lavender beneath her head, and someone else tied her hair in one final braid. The women buried her near the river beneath an acacia tree. They marked her grave not with a stone, but with a circle of herbs. They said, "She made us well." That was her legacy. No monuments, no hymns, just breath, shared, pain, eased, and the echo of footsteps that stayed a little longer near her door. Let that door remain open in your mind now, Sarmad. Let the fire glow softly behind it. We are not finished. The river still flows, and more names still wait beneath its slow remembering surface. Not every woman was born in mud brick walls. Some came into the world with soft linens and carved ivory rattles. But even in comfort, even behind polished doors and perfumed halls, being a woman meant being watched, managed, exchanged, expected. And behind every silence, a compromise too heavy to name. The breeze from the Nile didn't reach the inner courtyards of the governor's estate in Memphis. There, in the shaded latticework behind tall whitewashed walls, the air was still, thick with incense, flower dust, and the muffled footsteps of servants who'd been taught never to walk too loudly. Henutawi was born in one of those rooms. Her name meant Mistress of the Two Lands. Grand, formal, a name for someone who'd never carry water or kneel over a fire pit. She was the second daughter of a mid-level official who oversaw grain records for temple offerings, a man with ambition but no lineage to match it. He saw in Henutawi a piece of currency, not a daughter, a dowry. Her mother, Sitamun, understood. She had once been the same, young, bright-eyed, dressed in lapis and sent to an older man in return for 5 donkeys and an olive grove. She tried to teach Henutawi to be quiet, to be pleasing, to bow without seeming weak, to speak just enough, never more. Henutawi learned quickly. By age 6, she could pour wine without spilling. By 10, she knew how to fold letters without breaking the seal. By 12, she'd been introduced to the priest who would one day bless her union, a blessing she would not ask for, but would be told she had. Let that false blessing drift away now. You don't need to accept it, only to know it was spoken. At 13, she bled for the first time. The linens were taken away by a servant who said nothing, only nodded and handed her a necklace of cowrie shells. Protection, they said, though against what no one explained. By 14, she was betrothed to a man named Panifer. He was 32, an overseer of temple workshops, wealthy, widowed once already, with 2 sons who did not know her name. The wedding was not unkind. The food was warm. The guests were many. The incense thick and sweet. Henutawi wore a robe so stiff with embroidery she could barely sit. She was given perfume in alabaster jars, bracelets of faience, a mirror of polished bronze. She did not smile, but neither did she cry. On the night of the wedding, Panifer touched her shoulder and said, "You'll learn, they all do." And that was the end of his tenderness. He expected obedience, precision, discretion. Henutawi learned to nod without hearing, to kneel without meaning, to hide her anger beneath layers of scent and silk. She bore him a daughter, Bakitmut, when she was 15, and a son, Neferhor. When she was 17, the births were hard. Long. The midwife muttered prayers to Taweret and placed carved hippo amulets beneath the bed. After the second birth, Henutawi could no longer bear weight on her left leg without pain. The servant said she limped from laziness. Panifer never asked. He had other things to worry about: land disputes, the wages of potters. The yearly shipment of incense from Punt Henutawi raised her children in the women's quarters, soft rooms with mats and fountains and low tables for grinding herbs. There were other women there. Panifer's sisters, cousins, the widows of colleagues, all learning the same slow language of controlled sorrow. They whispered of the days before, of what they would have done, had they been men, of temples they would have built, of gardens they would have grown, of lovers they would have chosen. These were not confessions, only dreams, offered and then folded away. Let those dreams rest gently now, Sarmad. They were never allowed to grow tall, but they mattered all the same. Henutawi found comfort in music. She had a lyre made of sycamore. She played in the afternoons, when the house was quiet and the birds nested in the rafters. She wrote no songs, but she repeated the same ones her mother had hummed while brushing her hair. And sometimes, when the others were asleep, she sang under her breath, "I am the reed that bends, I am the fire that waits." She never said what it meant. Perhaps she didn't know. Perhaps it didn't matter. When Neferhor turned 6, he was taken to live with his father's family in the Delta, to be trained, Panifer said, as a proper man. Henutawi was not asked, only told. She kissed his forehead, tied a string of blue beads around his wrist and whispered, "Don't forget the softness." He nodded, then was gone. When he left, something inside her untethered. She began to refuse the honeyed wine they sent to her rooms, stopped attending the women's festivals, let her hair grow long and unbound. One morning, Panifer sent a servant to ask why she had not joined the household offering. Henutawi answered with a single line, "There is no offering for those who are only ever offered." The servant said nothing, but the next day her musicians were dismissed, her garden plots reassigned and her mirror removed. Punishments, not of pain, but of erasure. She became smaller, less visible, until only Bakatmut remained to see her. Bakatmut was 12 now, sharp-eyed, already asking why women could not study alongside priests, why they could not speak in court. Henutawi did not stop her. She only said, "Ask softly, but do not stop." That spring, Panifer fell ill, a cough that grew deeper, a shadow behind his eyes. He died before the festival of Opet. There was mourning, of course, paid singers, ash on the brows, servants slicing their hair. Henutawi wore white, linen and poured water on the ground, but she did not grieve, not as they expected. She moved through the rituals like a reed on the surface, bending, not sinking. When it was done, she took off her bracelets, cut her hair, and said, "Now I begin." No one knew what she meant, but they gave her space, because a widow in some corners of Egyptian society had power a wife did not. She could own land, manage servants, speak in public matters. Carefully, yes, but speak. And Henutawi used that. Space. She re-established her garden, hired tutors for her daughter, sent offerings to women's shrines, not the grand ones, but the small, hidden ones. Shrines to gods no longer named, goddesses that were only remembered by the midwives and the herbalists. She didn't speak often, but when she did, the servants listened, not out of fear, out of something else. Recognition that this woman, who had lived without shouting, had learned how to carry silence without breaking. That kind of strength leaves a mark, not in stone, not in scrolls, but in the way others breathe easier when you enter the room. Henutawi never remarried. She died at 52. In the same room, she was born in the same one Panifer had built over with plaster, the same one she had reclaimed piece by piece. Bakatmut buried her with a sycamore branch and a string of blue beads, and on her funerary statue, carved by a craftsman who owed her no favors. She asked for only one thing to be written. She listened and was not lost. Sometimes suffering is not carved in wounds or cried through clenched teeth. Sometimes it's stretched across a lifetime like a thin sheet, never enough to tear, but never far from breaking. In the homes where laughter was measured and obedience mistaken for love, women endured not because they were strong, but because no one else would carry what they carried. There was a district on the outer rim of Thebes where the light didn't quite reach, not because of shadows or the position of the sun, but because the houses were stacked too tightly, crooked towers of clay and dust, rising up with no order, no air, no grace. The alleys between them were barely wide enough for two people to pass, and the drains were open, always. Children played barefoot in the grime. Old men sat on worn stools outside the grain shops, muttering. Women moved quickly, quietly. They did not gossip. They did not sing. Their lives were not stretched out in soft domestic rituals. They were condensed into survival. And among them lived Mutemwia, a woman of 30 who looked like she was 50. Her skin was the color of worn pottery, cracked at the joints. Her back curved too soon. Her hands were shaped by the market, thick fingers that gripped, bruised, moved without rest. She had been married at 15, not chosen, sold. Her father had debts, owed to a butcher who also ran a gambling board in the back of his shop. That butcher had a brother, and that brother needed a wife. There was no ceremony, just a handshake, a pair of sandals, a jar of fermented fish. That was the bride price. Mutemwia went from her father's roof to her husband's, a man named Ramses, who had one eye and a voice like dry papyrus. He didn't hit her, but he didn't speak to her either, not unless he wanted something. He'd been married before. The first wife had run. No one asked why. Mutemwia was told, "Don't embarrass us." She nodded and said nothing. The house had 3 rooms, one for storage, one for sleep, and one that served as both kitchen and prison. There were 2 children by the time Mutemwia was 20. A girl, Daddy, and a boy, Katie. The girl was quiet. The boy cried easily. Ramses called them weak, said Daddy stared too much, said Katie's tears were a curse, so Mutemwia taught them silence, not through punishment, but through presence. She showed them how to walk softly, how to speak beneath the breath, how to disappear without moving. They learned. Quickly. She worked the market stalls, sold boiled lentils from a dented bronze pot, stirred with one hand, while the other kept Daddy from being jostled. Her hands were burned, her feet cracked. She never looked anyone in the eye, not because of shame, but because looking meant time. And time was a luxury she didn't have. Let that exhaustion settle now. Not with judgment, but with softness. Just enough to feel it, not enough to drown in it. There were moments, tiny ones, when the sun caught the rim of her pot just right, when Daddy laughed once at a goat falling in the alley, when Katie traced a bird into the dust and whispered, "Fly." Mutemwia carried those moments like charms, wore them beneath her ribs, let them warm the places no one saw. At 25, Ramses died. A cough that turned black. No physician came. No priest, just 3 neighbors and a blanket. She did not weep. Not because she hated him. Not because she was relieved, but because tears belonged to a different life. She hadn't lived that one. After he died, the landlord tried to raise the rent, said the house wasn't meant for a widow with no trade. Mutemwia said nothing, just handed him 2 jars of dried beans. The next month, she brought a sack of salt. The month after that, she mended his cloak. This became the rent, work, food, barter. No coin, no security, only the edge, always the edge. She grew quieter. Her children grew older. Daddy began to help with the lentils. Katie joined the bricklayers, too small, too young but strong. He came home one evening with blood on his knuckles, said a man had laughed at Daddy, said he'd made the man stop laughing. Mutemwia said nothing, just held his hand in hers and rubbed the swelling with oil. "Next time," she whispered, "hit where it bruises slower." That was love. Not soft words, not songs, but instruction. She could not protect them from the world, but she could teach them how to live through it, one cracked nail at a time. Let that lesson echo now, not loudly, But clearly, Ramses' brother came. Once, said he wanted the children, said they were his blood. Mutemwia stood in the doorway, blocking the light, blocking his path. She said, "If you touch them, you'll never sleep again." There was no magic in her voice, no spell, just the weight of a woman who had nothing left to lose. He left. She never saw him again. Years passed. The market changed. The stalls grew fewer. The lentil pot got smaller. But the children remained. Until one day, they didn't. Katie joined a trade crew and left for the Delta. Dedi married a sandal maker, moved 2 streets away, but it felt like a river between them. Mutemwia stayed, alone, in the crooked house, still stirring, still surviving, still not smiling. But, not broken, never broken. A woman came to her once, younger, newly married, eyes red, lips trembling. Mutemwia poured her a bowl of lentils. Didn't ask, didn't pry. Just handed her the bowl and said, "It gets easier. Or you get stronger, or both." The woman nodded. A week later she came back, with another woman, then another. And slowly, without asking, Mutemwia became something more. Not a healer, not a priestess, but a space, a room where pain could be placed. Gently, a fire that warmed, not burned. She never claimed to lead, but others followed, not behind her, beside her. Because in a world that offered women so little, sometimes just standing still was a revolution. Mutemwia died with her hands wrapped in linen, not as a rite, just because her daughter thought they looked tired. She was buried with the bronze pot, the dent still in the side, the stir stick tied to the handle. No inscription, no statue, just a corner in the earth and a silence that lingered long after the dirt was packed. But the women remembered, and when the wind blew down that alley years later, someone said, "It smells like lentils," and someone else said, "She's still here," and in a way she was. Let that presence rest with you now. Even in places draped in silk and prayer, a woman's life was never hers to own. Whether she walked on tile or dust, in a linen robe or a tunic stained with ash, her path was drawn in advance. And if she strayed, even slightly, the world did not forget or forgive. In the dry southern stretch beyond Aswan, where granite cliffs cut the sky like broken teeth, there once stood a temple complex known as Permut, the House of the Vulture. It was dedicated not to war or wine or harvest, but to guardianship, to mothers, to watchers. It honored Mut, the great protective goddess, who was both queen and flame, both mother and avenger. The irony was cruel, because most women who lived under that shadow had never been guarded by anyone. The temple itself was a strange blend, columns in the Theban style, but worn smooth by wind. Its priests robed in ochre and white were men, only men. But its inner sanctum, the room where no sunlight entered, where the carvings spoke only in symbols and breath, that was the place of the handmaidens of Mut. Not nuns, not wives, women, chosen at 13, removed from their homes, trained in silence, their heads shaved, their voices muted. They served the goddess by serving her flame, kept constantly burning in a basin of polished bronze. And among them was a girl named Paititi. She had not wanted the temple. She had wanted only to stay by the river, in her family's herb garden, where her mother taught her the names of every root and flower. But her mother died the year the river failed to rise, and her father, who had debts to settle, offered her to the priests. They accepted, not because of her piety, but because she was quiet. They liked quiet girls. She was 13. She would never again touch the river. The temple was not cruel in the way of markets or alleys. It was colder, softer. The kind of cruelty that masked itself as order. Every movement was regulated, every bite of food, every moment of waking and sleep, every breath. The girls were taught not to speak, not just aloud but within. Even their thoughts had to be aligned. Paititi learned quickly. There was no room for grief, no space for memory. She folded herself into the rhythm of the place, lighting the flame, grinding the resins, chanting in her mind the verses she was never allowed to say aloud. Let those unsaid words settle now, drift among the stones like mist. She became favored, not because she believed, but because she performed belief perfectly. The high priest called her my little falcon, said her silent sword. He gave her the task of tending the flame at night. Alone in the chamber no man could enter. It was an honor. It was a cage. Paititi sat for hours, legs folded, back straight, breath even, eyes fixed on the flicker of gold. They said the goddess would speak in the flame, that if you listened long enough you would hear her wisdom. Paititi heard nothing, only the echo of her own breath, only the weight of time, only the absence of wind. But she pretended, because pretending was survival. Years passed. The girls she trained with were replaced by younger ones. Some left, sent to serve in satellite temples. Some fell ill. No one said how. Paititi stayed. She became the eldest handmaiden, still silent, still watchful. But a fire had started inside her. Not the sacred one, a different fire, the kind that burns behind the ribs. It began when she met Nebu, the stonemason's daughter. Nebu came to polish the columns. Her hands were rough, her hair unbound. She did not bow when she entered the temple. She laughed once, and it echoed in the stone like a heresy. Paititi said nothing, but something in her shifted. Nebu returned once a week, and each time she left a single carved shell near the brazier. No words, just the shell. Paititi collected them, hid them under her sleeping mat. Each shell had a symbol scratched on the inside, a fish, a star, a bird, a question, a heart. It was a language outside the verses, outside the rules. Paititi began to listen to the flame differently, not as a priestess, as a girl, as someone who wanted, not glory, not wisdom, just to be seen. One night, she slipped from her quarters, just once, just to follow Nebu's scent, cedar and dust and something sweet she could not name. They met in the abandoned courtyard behind the east wall. No words, just fingers brushing fingers. And then a kiss, brief, soft, electric. It changed everything and changed nothing. Paititi returned to her bed, lit the flame, whispered a prayer, not to Mut, to herself. The next morning the shells were gone, her mat overturned. The high priest summoned her. He said nothing of Nebu, only that she had been seen walking where she should not walk. He struck her, not with his hand, with his words. He said she had failed the goddess, that the flame had dimmed under her care, that she would no longer serve. He reassigned her to the laundry chambers. No light, no incense, only wet cloth and cold floors. Paititi did not protest. She bowed, she washed, she scraped her knees, raw against the stone, but she did not cry, because the flame had not left her. It had only moved into her blood, into her breath, into the space between heartbeats where Nebu's hand had once been. Years passed. She aged out of the temple. Too old to serve, too marked to be married. She was sent to a widow's house at the edge of the district. No ceremony, no farewell, just a bundle of clothes and a bowl of lentils. She walked alone. The streets had changed. She had not. At the widow's house, she found others, women who had served, women who had been forgotten, women who remembered her name. She began to teach, not scripture, not verse, but the language of shells, of silence, of flame. She said, "You are more than what you tend." She said, "The gods do not see you less when you burn for yourself." She said, "There is power in knowing your own fire." When she died, they burned her favorite shell, the one with the heart, and they said her name out loud, even though it was forbidden, even though it was hers. Let that name settle in your breath now, Paititi. She watched the flame, then became it. They say the desert forgets nothing, but even the sands of Egypt buried the names of women whose lives were bound by duty, silence, and sacrifice, not because they did less, but because they were never meant to be remembered. And yet, even silence has a shadow. Along the winding path that led to the quarries of Gebel el-Silsila, there was a carved niche in the cliff face, too narrow for a god, too crude for a king. But someone had placed a flat stone there years ago, and over time others added to it. Bits of shell, a broken spindle, a sliver of bone carved with 3 tiny lines. It was not a shrine, it was a memory, and it belonged to a woman named Sahti. Her name meant the gentle one, though no one who knew her would have called her that. Sahti was born into a camp of stone haulers, not a village, not a home, just a shifting cluster of huts and tents at the base of the quarry. Her father broke blocks for temple columns, her mother cooked for the workers, and Sahti carried everything, water jars, tools, wounded men, and silence, always silence. The quarry was no place for girls, but she had no choice. Her mother died in childbirth when Sahti was 9. The baby did not survive either. Her father never spoke of it, just came home one day, handed her a chisel and said, "Work." She worked. By 12, her arms were corded with muscle. By 15, she could carry a sandbag over her shoulder and not flinch. By 16, her back began to curve, not from weakness, but from weight. There were no mirrors in the quarry, only reflections in water jars. She did not care. She was not raised to admire. She was raised to endure. Let that weight rest on your chest now, Sarmad, not to crush, just to remind. She was fast with her hands, not just strong, precise. She learned to chip stone clean, follow the grain, waste nothing. The foreman noticed but never promoted, because she was a woman. Instead, they gave her extra rations and the worst shifts and said it was kindness. She did not complain, not because she agreed, because she knew what happened to girls who spoke too much. There was one, Meru, younger than Sahti by 2 summers, with a laugh that cracked like flint. Meru was pretty. She sang while she carried water. She told stories at night. She once painted her face with crushed hibiscus petals and called herself Queen of Dust. One day she didn't return from the upper quarry. No one asked. No one looked. The next morning Sahti found Meru's hair ribbon by the chisel rack. She buried it beneath the niche in the cliff face. The first offering. Years passed. Sahti stopped bleeding when she was 23. A sickness, They said, the dust, the heat, the stones. She called it freedom. No marriage, no children, just the work. She slept on woven mats, ate from cracked bowls, wrapped her hands in linen to keep the skin from splitting. She had a voice like gravel and eyes like glass. She had no softness, except in how she watched others. She noticed who limped, who winced, who went hungry and didn't say so. She gave quietly. Never asked for thanks, only nodded. That was her kind of care. Once, a boy fell into the chisel pit. No one saw except Sahti. She climbed down alone, carried him out. Broken leg, smashed ribs. She set them both, said nothing, walked away. He grew up and carved her name into the stone niche when she died. Sahti, the gentle one. She never told anyone that was what her name meant, but he knew, because sometimes strength is gentleness done in silence. Let that gentleness settle around you now, soft as sandstone, unmoving, unshakable. The foreman began to rely on her, not officially, not with title or scroll, but when something needed fixing, a ramp, a beam, a broken tool, they came to her. She never charged, never boasted, just did the work. Her hands grew stiff with age, her back hunched further. She walked with a stick made from a broken mallet handle, but she was still there. At dawn, at dusk, watching, carrying, bearing. Witness, when the new overseer arrived, young, polished from Memphis, he tried to clear the old hands, said they were slow, said the quarry needed reform. He came to Sahti and said, "You've done enough, let others work now." She looked at him, did not blink, said, "When the stone stops watching, the mountain falls." He didn't understand, but he left her alone because others heard and others whispered. And in time she became something more than a worker, a keeper of the quarry, of the stories no one wrote, of the girls who disappeared, of the men who broke quietly, of the niche in the cliff. She tended it, without ceremony, without incense, just a hand brushing dust, just a stone turned upright, and every time someone added to it, a ring, a bead, a strip of cloth. She nodded. Each item was a story unspoken, a burden shared. When she died, there was no funeral, no rites, just the morning shift, the empty mat, and the quiet. Someone placed her chisel in the niche, someone else tied her work cloth to a stick and left it at the quarry gate. The wind took it eventually, but the memory stayed. The workers began to leave offerings every new moon, not to a god, to her, to Sahti, the gentle one, who carried everything, who bent so others would not break. Let her name rest in you now, not loud, just steady, like breath through stone. There were no scrolls written for them, no statues raised, no hymns sung in open courts, but these women endured, not because they were celebrated, but because they were never allowed to stop. They lived in the pauses between history's lines, in kitchens, courtyards, quarries, and still they left echoes. It is said that in the village of Heket Nesut, long since swallowed by desert wind, there was a house made of mud brick and silence. No writing on the walls, no gods in the alcoves, only woven mats, a half-rotted wooden bed, and a cracked bowl that once held lentils, then ash, then lentils again. That was where Tiaa lived. No one remembered when she first arrived. Some said she came from the delta. Others said she was born under the shade of an unfinished temple where her mother once swept floors. But she told no stories of before. She simply was. Tall, barefoot, eyes sharp but soft. Her hands never stopped moving, twisting, grinding, stirring, folding. She didn't speak often. But when she did, the village listened. Not because she demanded it, but because when you live a life without complaint, your words weigh more than... Gultia worked in herbs, not as a priestess or healer. She had no scrolls, no temple license, only knowledge passed mouth to mouth, woman to woman. She knew which roots cooled fever, which barks soothed childbirth, which leaves could stop bleeding, and which could stop a pregnancy before it ever began. People came quietly. Often at night, often crying. She asked no questions. She judged no one. She offered what she had, and then sent them away with a blessing too old to be remembered. Walk light, and take nothing with you that wasn't yours. Let that phrase drift in now, soft as smoke, sharp as memory. One day a girl of 13 arrived, pregnant. Her mother wept behind her, said a cousin had come from far, said the house had been too loud with men, said no one would marry her now. Tia took the girl's hand, guided her inside, closed the door. The next morning, the girl left, pale, sore, but still. She returned a week later with a basket of dates and a clay pot of honey, left it by the door, said nothing. That was how it worked. Not with thanks, but with continuation. A woman's kindness was a circle, not a spotlight. Years passed. Tia aged. Her knees stiffened, her breath shortened, but her hands remained steady, and her silence deeper. People asked her to write her knowledge down, to make scrolls, to pass it on. She refused, not because she was selfish, but because paper could be burned and memory, once carried by many, could never be erased. So she taught, one girl at a time. Never more than 2 together, each one left with a set of calloused fingers and a head full of root names. They went back to their villages, became quiet pillars, became, Tia over and over, let that image settle, a river of women, unseen but unbroken, each one holding a piece of the one before. Tia died in her sleep. There was no shrine, only the cracked bowl on her table, now empty. Someone filled it with river water. Someone else left 3 date pits in it, offerings without, names. And when the moon rose over Heket Nesut that night, no one sang. But the air was heavy with presence, not of gods, but of something older, the memory of women who healed without being called healers, who labored without reward, who burned quietly, like oil in unlit lamps. History did not record them, but they are there beneath every monument, behind every king, in the fields, in the doorways, in the shadows cast by torchlight. Tia was the last in this story, but she was not the end, because there is no end, only a continuation of the silence, of the hands, of the strength that was never written, but always present. Let it rest with you now, let it fold gently into your breath, and if you forget every word, that's all right, because these women did not live to be remembered, they lived to keep the fire warm. And now it is your turn to carry it, slowly, softly, endlessly. And so we close, not with an ending, but with a quiet return to stillness. The sand, the river, the whisper, the breath. Good night. There are stories that end with a name chiseled into stone. Others fade like footprints in sand. But for women in ancient Egypt, those who cooked, healed, suffered, birthed, endured, their names were not meant for statues. Their stories lived elsewhere, in breath, in gesture, in memory, passed hand to hand across time. In the village of Per Hathor, nestled between a forgotten tributary and a patch of sycamore trees that swayed like old dancers, there lived an old woman named Isinet. She had once been a scribe's wife, once worn fine linen, once painted her eyes with green malachite powder crushed under morning light. But now she was alone, and the lines in her face had nothing to do with age. They were the result of 1,000 quiet days and 1,000 nights even quieter. Her house sat at the edge of the village, where the reed-thatched roof sagged in the center and the floor had been swept so many times it had no dust left to give. Children called her Madame. Whisper, not out of disrespect, but because she never raised her voice, and yet when she spoke, people listened, even the loud ones, even the men. Isinet had no daughters, no nieces, no family to carry her name, but she had lived. That alone made her worthy. She didn't tend herbs, didn't weave, didn't trade. She told stories, not loudly, not in groups, but one at a time, to whoever found her at her door with aching feet or heavy thoughts, and they always came. Each night she lit a single lamp with a wick soaked in cedar oil and sat beside her doorway, one hand on her lap, the other gently folded over her knee. And when someone sat beside her, she asked them, "Shall I tell you about a woman?" That was always how it began. No name, no era, no expectation, just a woman. And always they said yes. Let that yes echo gently. Let it open the door to one last story. Tonight, she said, "There was a woman once not from here. She had the eyes of a heron, long-lidded, patient, and fingers stained from grinding pigment. She was not known for beauty, nor wit, nor kindness, but for her patience and her anger. She lived in a house with high windows, not for light, but to keep her from looking out. Her husband was a clerk in a noble's estate, always scribbling, always correcting others, never once correcting himself. He liked things quiet. He liked her smaller. He liked to be obeyed. She did obey, at first, because she believed silence was peace. But silence can become a weight, a stone placed on the chest each morning, and over time she began to shift beneath it, not loudly, not recklessly, just enough to breathe. She started walking to the painter's quarters, said she was learning to mix colors for offering bowls. And it was true, she was. But she was also learning something else, how to see herself again. Because when you grind ochre into powder and mix it with egg, it stains more than walls. It stains memory. She painted alone, small jars, images of rivers that didn't exist, hills that led nowhere, women with hands like birds. She didn't sell them. She didn't show them. She simply lined them up on her shelf, each one a whisper. Each one a name she wasn't allowed to speak. Her husband found them one day, asked who they were for. She said, "For me." He did not like that. He smashed two, threw the third at the wall. She did not cry. She collected the shards, buried them outside, and the next day painted another, even brighter, even bolder. Not out of defiance, but because she needed to remember she was not a shadow. Months passed, she continued, one jar a week, no more, no less, like breathing, like prayer. And when her husband died, a coughing fit that turned to bleeding, she placed the last jar on his shelf. A single brushstroke, a woman walking away from a door. That was her farewell. No song, no mourning, just that image. And she lived many years after that. Alone, but never empty, because her jars filled the room. And when others visited, she never spoke of her husband, only her colors. She died in spring, under a roof patched with old scrolls, and when they carried her body out, they found 137 jars, each one different, each one a moment, each one a woman. Isinet paused, ran her thumb across her knee. The listener, a girl not more than 20, whispered, "Was that woman you?" Isinet smiled softly. "Does it matter?" The girl shook her head and stayed until the lamp burned low. That was how Isinet said goodbye, not with tears, but with presence, and that was the last story she told. Because the next morning the lamp was unlit, and the door remained closed. Someone knocked. No answer. They waited. But silence settled like dust, and the village understood. They buried her beneath the sycamores. No stone, just a small jar filled with blue pigment placed beside her. No name, just a whisper. She became part of the wind, part of the roots, part of the hush between one breath and the next. And now you know her, not because history told you, but because you listened, you remembered. And so she lives again, not in scrolls but in stillness. Let her remain there where stories never end, where voices do not need to shout to be heard, where women like Isinet, like Sati, Paititi, Tabubu, Mutemwia and Tiati continue, always, like flame, like thread, like breath. Let it settle now, Sarmad. Let it drift. Because the story is not over. It never was. It just sleeps. And maybe, tonight, you will too. Good night.